Introduce the authors. First, we have Erik Brynjolfsson, who is the director of Stanford's Digital Economy Lab, a member of ARI's Board of Advisors, and one of the most prolific economists writing about the economics of technology today. And next, we have Bharat Chandar. He is a postdoctoral researcher at the Stanford Digital Economy Lab and a rising star in the world of AI and labor economics. Thank you for both for joining us. And for today's event, we plan to give Erik and Bharat about 10 minutes to talk about their research, followed by roughly 20 minutes of moderated Q&A, and finally questions from the audience. So if you're in the audience and if you have questions, please send them to us using Zoom's Q&A feature, or if you're tuning in via Twitter, leave a question in the replies portion of Twitter. With that, Erik and Bharat, can you start by telling us about your paper?
Sure. Well, first, thanks so much, John, for inviting us. We're honored to have a chance to share some of our work with your audience here, and we're very much looking forward to the questions and comments. This is very early research, so I'm sure people have suggestions on ways we can extend it and improve it. And I also want to thank ADP for providing the data, the main data that we used, and Anthropic as well. And I also want to mention that, sorry, Ruyu can't be here. She just had a baby, but she was working on it right up to the last minute. So let me just say a couple of words about our basic findings. Then Bharat's going to dive in with some graphics that'll demonstrate a little bit more what we were up to. The main thing is that, like everybody, we've been hearing all this excitement about AI's potential to transform the economy. Some scary stories about destroying jobs, some optimistic stories about new things being created, some other people thinking, hey, it's no big deal. They were mostly based on anecdotes or relatively small data sets. So we were happy when we got access to this ADP data that was much more detailed, the world's largest payroll company. And just to preview some of the findings that Bharat will dive in a little bit more deeply, we did find that the most exposed jobs, things like coders, and call center operators had a drop in employment for the youngest age group, people aged 22 to 25. There was not a general drop in employment for people in those exposed groups. Senior people continued to have more growth. We also continued to have growth for people in areas that were not exposed, like home health aides. And perhaps most intriguingly, we had continued growth for people who are using AI to augment their tasks rather than automate them. We'll describe that in a little bit more detail, but you can use AI to sort of learn new skills and to do things that you couldn't do before. And people who are using AI in that way tended to have growing employment. So there's, different effects on different groups. But this was all fairly recent. Since late 2022, early 2023, we started seeing these breaks, and you'll see it graphically in a minute. We're planning on continuing to monitor this as the data keeps coming in, and we'll see whether it continues to grow and whether there are other phenomena. And we're looking forward to questions and comments and suggestions about how we can dive in deeper. But with that, let me turn over to Bharat, who has a lot more detail on what I just laid out.
Yeah, thank you, Erik and John, for that setup. And now we'll just quickly share some of the results to set ideas about what we covered in the paper. As Erik mentioned, this has been a hot topic, and we really wanted to dig into it. So in this paper, we're asking, are we already seeing changes in the labor market driven by AI, and particularly for entry-level workers, because this has been a segment that people have been particularly interested in and wondering what's happening with them. So we're using this data from ADP. As Erik mentioned, it's a private company, and they're the largest payroll software provider in the United States. So let's just get straight into the results. This graph is showing employment for software developers by age group. And it's all relative to late 2022, around the time of ChatGPT. So what you can see here is that for the earliest career workers, age 22 to 25, employment is about down 20% compared to its peak around late 2022. In contrast, if you look at older workers, mid-career workers and more senior workers over the age of 50, we're seeing pretty steady employment increases that look about on trend from what we were seeing even before this time period. Now, this isn't just a story about tech jobs and software developers. We also see these patterns for customer service, where the most prominent declines are for these youngest workers, age 22 to 25. And in fact, for these mid-career workers, we're actually seeing continued employment growth for those groups. Now, as Erik said, there are groups where we don't see these same patterns. And a good example of this is home health aides, nursing aides, and psychiatric aides. Here, it's actually the youngest age group that's seeing the fastest employment growth. And you might think that this is a job that has much less AI exposure because of a prominent physical and social component to doing the work. And this is a sort of job where we're seeing employment growth for the youngest workers. Now, these results are actually much more general. Here, we're looking at different AI exposure levels coming from work by Alonso et al. And the darker lines here are more exposed occupations. And what you can see is that for the youngest age group, the most exposed occupations are having employment declines, whereas the least exposed age groups are having employment growth. Now, for the older age groups, we're not seeing very similar patterns. The most exposed jobs are also seeing employment growth. And so we don't see this divergence that we see for the youngest age groups. Now, we also want to highlight that there's been an overall relative slowdown in entry-level hiring. We can see here that overall employment for young workers has flatlined a little bit, especially if you compare it to the older age groups and mid-career workers. And what's striking about this is that slowdown in employment for young workers is being driven by jobs that are more exposed to AI. So we're seeing a 6% decline in employment in those types of jobs, whereas we're not seeing that for older age groups. And in addition, for jobs that are less exposed to AI, we're seeing that job growth for young workers is comparable as it is for older workers. Now, we want to caution here that these could be driven by other changes in the US economy, and we don't want to attribute all of this to AI, certainly. We're going to test some alternative hypotheses that we thought might be driving some of these trends and that people suggested to us. And we're going to see how the results hold up when we consider those alternatives. And we're going to find that a lot of these patterns are still going to hold when we're looking when we're considering those alternatives as well. So now I want to highlight something that Erik mentioned, which is that employment seems to be declining for the most exposed jobs where AI automates work for young workers. And this is using automation measures provided by Claude for how people are using their LLM. And if you want to think of some occupations that might be more automative in nature, you could think of occupations such as software development, accounting and auditing, and information clerks. So these are the types of jobs where usage of LLMs could directly replace certain parts of a workflow. In contrast, employment for young workers is increasing in jobs where AI augments work. So you can see that the darkest line here is actually increasing still. And examples of some jobs where AI use is more augmentative include occupations such as management, nursing, maintenance, and repair, where it's not replacing certain aspects of the job. It might help you learn or get feedback on the output of your work in ways that are augmenting your work. Now, we do more sophisticated methods in the paper to assess whether other alternatives could be driving this. We refer you to the paper to that, but we find that the results still hold when we consider, for example, controls for the firm, et cetera. Now, one interesting finding in the paper is that we do not find a clear divergence in compensation. We're seeing these patterns mostly for employment and not for salaries. So you can see here that even for the youngest workers, we're not seeing a major divergence in salary, and we're going to continue to track this on an ongoing basis to see how that pattern changes over time. Now, finally, you might consider various alternative hypotheses that could explain some of these results. And we just want to highlight a few that we considered in the paper to kind of test other ideas that could be driving these trends. One is that we tried excluding the tech sector and excluding jobs that are involve software or computer development, and we get very similar results there. Second, we looked at teleworkable versus non-teleworkable jobs. These are jobs that are amenable to remote work or not, we might be worried that part of these patterns are being driven by a return from work from home. And we find these same patterns for non-teleworkable jobs. So it doesn't seem like that's explaining all of what we're finding here as well. Third, we find this both for college graduates and for non-college workers. So we're seeing this kind of across the education distribution. And one interesting thing here is that for non-college workers, we're not actually only seeing it for the youngest age groups. We're even seeing it for workers up to age 40. Fourth, we see this for both men and women. And fifth, we're seeing this even if we include part-time and temporary workers. We have a lot more in the paper, and we're happy to discuss some alternative ideas and also get your suggestions on alternative ideas for us to test. But those are the main facts in the paper, and we'd love to shift into the Q&A now, John.
Great. Thank you, Bharat and Erik. Fascinating paper, and I strongly recommend everyone who can read the actual paper itself. A lot of interesting information and a lot of commentary that has come from that. So my first question for you, there's a lot of people watching who are not economists. What are a few key takeaways that you think are just very important and just sticking to the facts? Like what was something that maybe either stood out to you or you think policymakers should most care about? That you would like to highlight in just like a minute or so?
Well, I'll highlight, really the first fact, which is that we really didn't know going into this what we would find in terms of AI exposed occupations and different age groups. To me, it was really striking that this Ilandu et al. Taxonomy, they did it back in 2023. They basically ranked every occupation by how much they thought it was going to be exposed to LLMs. It was a paper written in Science. How well that held up. If you saw the charts that Bharat presented, it was just this monotonic relationship. The more exposed a occupation was, the more the job change was for the young workers. And that second point is also important. To me, it was a little unexpected how much of a difference there was between younger and older workers.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard both kinds of stories going around. You often hear that this is tough on older workers. We found the opposite, that actually the older workers were doing better, and it was really striking to see that happening. So both those things were I won't say surprises, but something we really couldn't have known without looking at the data.
And I think one thing I would add to that is the augmentation versus automation results. I found that pretty striking as well, where we're seeing this mostly in jobs where AI use is more automative, but in contrast, in the sort of jobs where AI use is more augmentative, we're actually still seeing employment growth. So I thought that was pretty striking.
Yeah, that works. And going to that younger versus older worker in AI exposed occupations dichotomy, what do you think is happening? Because one thing I found interesting is while the number of jobs is shifting, the compensation is not. That's just following trend, if I understood your paper correctly.
That's right.
What are some hypotheses as to what could account for a change in the net number of jobs for both those groups without changes in wages?
Well, we'd love to hear people in your group, maybe they have some thoughts as well, but, I'm happy to also hypothesize a bit. I mean, there is, some research about wages being a little sticky. And so the young people were really on the margin of being hired or not hired. We found most of the effects in the hiring side rather than the firing side. So they're on that more flexible margin compared to senior people. So that may be part of it. It's just a simple reason why you'd expect more of an effect there. Something that's a little more sort of
And just
substantive.
to interrupt, when you say wages are sticky, you mean it's unlikely for people to change their salary based on like effects on the like labor
You know how
market?
hard it is to give somebody a wage cut. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
that's
not
right.
something that happens a lot. Like maybe over time they don't keep up with inflation or something, but to actually cut somebody's wage is a really hard thing to have happen. So that, maybe it's not shocking to me that we don't see a lot of that happening. But in terms of the young folks also being more exposed, it may be, and this is just a hypothesis, looking at the data, that the kind of skills they have, they learn from school, they learn from books, they are things that LLMs are also learning. I mean, LLMs read text, all the stuff in books and articles and Reddit and elsewhere. More senior people, in addition to that, they also pick up things on the job, tacit knowledge that nobody ever writes down. So it's possible that what senior people, the skills they have are more complementary to LLMs, whereas the junior people, they're more substitutes. It's a hypothesis we'd love to explore further, but it'd be consistent with the data.
Great.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing to that, we were actually chatting with David Otter about this as well, about the wage impacts. And
David
we do want
Otter is
to,
a MIT labor economist.
yes, and we do want to mention that the wage impacts are a little bit ambiguous. They're theoretically ambiguous, economically ambiguous, and one of the reasons that's true is because AI could complement certain types of work, substitute for other types of work. They could shift the type of person that's being hired versus not being hired. And it can be a little complicated to think through all those implications and what they'll be for wages. So we do want to do more research here and think through some of these implications. And if people have suggestions, like Erik was saying, we would love to hear them as well. But we do think that it's a little bit ambiguous what the impact could be on wages.
Great. So I'm already getting a lot of questions because your paper apparently is very popular. So I want to remind everyone, if you have questions, please send them to us via Zoom or Twitter. And I'm actually going to start with one of these questions and intersperse my questions with the audience questions. So someone has asked, how do you separate AI augmentation from AI automation, especially for jobs that involve many tasks? Which that seems kind of difficult to do.
Why don't you take that first,
Yeah, sure.
Bharat?
So I can give you an overview of this. So this is actually done by a paper released by researchers from Anthropic. And to give you a sense of how they do that, they have this collection of conversations that are coming into Claude, and they associate each of those conversations with different occupations. Now, the way they classify them in terms of whether this occupation is using AI more automatively or augmentatively is they classify these conversations in different buckets. So, for example, is the conversation that this person is having with Claude, are they trying to use it to learn about a new topic, or are they getting feedback on some output that they created and they just want to have a back and forth and kind of discuss it with the LLM? Those would be considered more augmentative uses of AI. In contrast, for more automative uses, those are things like I have a workflow and I'm completely offloading it to the LLM and I'm not really getting feedback from it. Or if you think of a coding job, they might be sending writing they're asking the LLM to write some code. That code might return a bug. They just put the bug back into the LLM, it generates new code, they run that code, and then they're not really adding any additional value compared to what the LLM is doing. So that those are more automated uses of AI. So they classify the conversations that are coming into Claude into each of these buckets, and then they look at the share of conversations that are automated for an occupation versus augmentative versus none of the above. And that's their measure of how they come up with these automated versus augmentation measures. And those are what we're using in the paper to classify different occupations.
And if I could just add to that, we have examples of this at the end of the paper. So if you pop over there, you can see exactly what Bharat just described. I'll also highlight that this is a measure that came out before we wrote the paper, and so I was kind of delighted that we could take these things from Rolando et al. And from the Anthropic team and pop them in, and they were actually quite predictive of the kinds of employment effects we saw. It was also, for me, it was kind of personally gratifying because I've been writing for a while about the importance of using AI to augment work, not just replace it, not just automate it. I wrote a paper called The Turing Trap where I advocated for that. So having some empirical evidence that it lined up that way was interesting to see. And it is an important thing. I think there are a lot of headlines about how our paper is showing some falling employment in some categories. But here we see that if you use AI to augment, you actually have growing employment.
Great. And Erik, I do want to recommend to the audience your paper, The Turing Trap. It's a really interesting read, and I just want to recommend it to everyone. Okay, so I'm getting a lot of questions about the young worker impacts. I'm going to read maybe two of them. How should young workers react to this data? That's one question. And if you're a young worker in a high exposed job, what can you do to best prepare in the coming years? So you can take either both of those or one of those. Erik or Bharat, do you have any comments on that?
I'm
Erik.
happy to dive in first. Sure. Um, you know, to be clear, there's always been churn in the job market, and people are always going to have to learn new skills. And I think that the one thing we should never have thought is we could just like freeze and just have things the same. So what are the new skills going forward? I mean, this is an emerging thing. But one thing, I had a interesting conversation with Andrew Ng, who's a great AI researcher, and he's hiring a lot of these folks. And he was complaining, ironically, that a lot of young people weren't as familiar with using AI as some of the senior workers. And he pointed the finger at us in universities that our coding courses, we teach the principles of coding, but most of the time we don't teach how to use Cursor or Replit or some of these other tools, whereas that's something you learn on the job. So he thought that the curricula needed to catch up and give people these skills, not just teaching the broad principles, but also one of the kinds of knowledge that people have been learning on the job is how to use AI more effectively, and the senior people were better at that. So one piece of advice is for young people to dive in, and until us universities catch up a little bit, do it a bit on your own.
Great.
Yeah, I do think our research raises a lot of important and interesting policy questions, questions for young people, and we're going to continue to do research on this. We encourage other people to do research on this as well, and I do think that this raises a lot of interesting questions that policymakers should be thinking about.
Great. Thank you. Let's do another question from the audience. Let's see. Okay, there has been some research, and specifically a study from Meter, that AI isn't capable of functionally replacing junior level developers. With that in mind, it seems a plausible explanation is that business leaders think AI is capable enough to replace these employees and are making decisions accordingly, even if this isn't true, at least yet. Do you see this as a plausible explanation, or does your research indicate that AI is replacing these workers functionally?
Well, let me go a little beyond what we found in the data here and go to some conversation. I spent a lot of time talking to coders and visiting with them, and I disagree with the premise of the question.
Okay.
The people I talk to say that it is actually augmenting their capabilities quite a bit. And I recently talked to someone who was saying, there's a project they were working on that would have taken 3 months, and it took them 2 or 3 weeks because of these coding tools. So that's not necessarily replacing the work, but it is certainly allowing them to do things a lot more efficiently. And furthermore, this person emphasized that it was the junior people whose tasks were most likely to be partly done by these coding tools. Often you'll have a senior person who kind of breaks up the job into different categories and asks a junior person to work on, the UI or the database or something. And those subcomponents now in part are being done by the tools. So I think I've seen enough examples where the tools really are making a difference. I'm familiar with that Meter study, and I think it was really striking. I think it was a well done study, but there are 5 other studies that go the other direction. So I don't think I would put all my eggs in just that one study.
Great.
If I could add one thing to that, we certainly used AI coding tools to help us with the coding for this project as well. And I think we were able to get the paper out so much faster because we were able to do that. So we were very fortunate that we were able to use these tools, in fact. Um, Obviously you have to be able to assess the work and whether the code is correct and is producing the thing that you think it's producing. And that does require some expertise. It does kind of complement the sort of knowledge that you have about your field and what you're doing. And yeah, I would just second what Erik said as well about the Meter study was well done and very striking. There are also various other studies in that space, and we should have a holistic view of the research. And I would say that's true for our paper as well.
And one more point on that is like, as these technologies are rolled out, what you see is people are learning how to use them effectively. And sometimes they don't use them effectively. Sometimes people use them in ways that are counterproductive. And the Meter study describes some individuals who are, ending up spending more time, not less time, in the end using it. And we've all had that experience when we're playing around with some new technology and it ends up, you end up wasting 2 or 3 hours that you hadn't intended to. But I think that's the learning curve phase of it. And one of the things that we're all working on is figuring out when it can actually be useful and when it isn't. It's a jagged edge, as Ethan Mollick has described it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of studies looking at different tasks, including one of yours, Erik, that looks at call center workers, and there's different results depending on the different tasks, and that will continue to evolve as both the technology evolves and our learning of how to use these technology evolves as well.
That's right. In that group, there were some people who got up to 35% in productivity improvements or more, and others that got basically 0%.
Right. Okay, so question I have. So I've read a lot of economists react to your paper, and I was curious, have you seen any reactions to your paper that either changed your mind or made you want to further explore a specific topic?
It was incredibly gratifying to see the people weigh in, and we've seen a bunch of them on Twitter, X, and elsewhere. A lot of people just emailed us directly. One insight that was really helpful was Joshua Gans describing how our results were consistent with the idea that this technology was complementing or augmenting more senior workers, and the patterns were very much in line with what you'd expect if that was what was happening. So that was a good way to kind of interpret what we're doing. I would build on that and say, I mean, he emphasized the complement part. It could be both. It could be complementing one group of people and substituting for other groups of people. And so that may be even more what's going on. But I think it's exactly what we were hoping for. We put these facts out there, these 6 facts, and now it's fodder for people to try to understand what that means for the labor market. Too often in this field, like many others, there's a lot of theorizing and armchair stuff based on anecdotes here and there, and we want to do what we can to provide some data that make sure that those theories are grounded in reality.
Right.
Yeah, and we think the discussion around this is great for science. We're very open to suggestions on other hypotheses to test out or other ways to kind of work with the data, and we're very open to that as well. So, and we encourage other people to do research on this as well.
Right. One of the comments I saw was from Professor David Deming at Harvard. I'm not sure if you've read his reaction. So he talks
Yeah.
about the sample period you use is from people employed. Sorry, your paper looks at firms that continuously employ people from 2021 to 2025. But that could mean that many startups that maybe started after 2021 have some employment effects that aren't captured in your paper,
Right.
and that many early career workers in AI exposed professions might be going to these startups. How do you react to that comment and any sort of addition to that you'd like to make?
It's a great point, and maybe it's worth at this point elaborating that we do not have a perfect representative sample of the economy. We don't have an experiment where we gave some people LMs and we didn't. So this is a sample that it's a great sample. We're very happy with it, but it definitely does have some of these concerns, like what David brought up. In order to be consistent, we created a balanced panel. That is to say, we had the exact same set of firms at the beginning, at the end, so we wouldn't be biased by ADP signing up a new customer or dropping a customer or whatever. We didn't want that to be influencing the results. But a side effect of that is that if you're a startup that started in the middle of a period, you will not be included in our data. It's certainly possible that startups have a different hiring pattern than these continuing firms, and it's something that's worth diving into a little bit more. I know that Daniel Rock and Hung Yi are exploring that hypothesis a little bit further, and we'll see that. We can do a little bit of it with our data sample. We could look at subsets, and that's something that we'll look at going forward. But yeah, right now I can't give you a definitive answer as to whether that's what's driving it.
If I could add 2 things to that. One is we do have a result in the paper where we don't take this balanced sample of firms, and we get very similar results there. So that, maybe that speaks to that a little bit, but I think Erik's point still holds that ADP may not capture some types of startups, et cetera. Now, one other thing I would quickly mention is that we're seeing these employment patterns, even if we say take out computer occupations, take out the tech sector. So this is more broad-based than the types of jobs that you might think would end up in startups. We're seeing it for customer service. We're seeing it for, jobs such as like secretaries, receptionists, like college graduates, non-college graduates. So my hunch is that that's not as consistent with the startup storytelling, driving everything that's going on here. But we definitely do want to dig into the data a little more, like Erik was saying.
Right. Do another audience question. So, did the fact that the results hold across telework and non-telework workers, so you found similar results for both, surprise you? Wouldn't you expect the effect to be stronger for telework workers since there's no physical element?
Well,
Right.
go ahead, Bharat. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's worth clarifying a little bit more about that. So on average, teleworkable jobs are more AI exposed, and so on average, we are actually seeing declining employment for that group for the youngest workers. And like I said, on average, non-teleworkable occupations are not as exposed to AI. But that said, within the non-teleworkable group, there are some occupations that are more exposed and less exposed to AI. So if you want to think of some jobs that are more exposed but also non-teleworkable, we have some examples in the paper. They include things such as um, bank tellers, tax preparers, travel agents, things like that, where a lot of the work is kind of done in person or domestically. But you could imagine that a lot of the work could be done using AI tools. And for those types of jobs, we are also seeing these declines in employment. So it's worth bearing that out. On average, the teleworkable jobs are more exposed, but even within the non-teleworkable group, there's this variation, and we're seeing the same patterns within that group.
And I'll just say, like the questioner, we weren't sure what to expect. We thought maybe there would be, maybe all of this was being driven by teleworkable people. And so when we got the first results, we went and basically wrote down some alternative explanations. And then, Bharat was sending me at 3 in the morning. He was very excited, these updates. And here's the latest results. So we're just calling them as we see them. And it turns out that remote work does not explain away these results.
So I have another question. A lot of people care about definitions you guys are using. So how did you define whether a job was AI exposed, and how sensitive are your results to changes in this definition? For example, Anthropic's task level data and Copilot usage studies suggest that any occupation involving information gathering and synthesis could be considered exposed, which would cover a very broad set of jobs. So, how do you define AI exposed jobs, and how sensitive are your results to any changes to that?
Well, let me start, and Bharat may want to go into more detail. One of the things that I was very exciting was we just took these pre-defined categories, Elandu et al. In their science paper, the Anthropic one. We would love, and we're here publicly asking if Google and OpenAI would create similar indexes the way that Anthropic did. We'd be delighted to use them. We are exploring some other AI indexes. So this was a set of metrics that was the Alandu et al. In 2023 they basically went through all the tasks in the economy, about 18,000 tasks, and scored each one as to whether or not they thought an LLM could do it. Some things like lifting a box, LLMs can't really help with that. Others like writing a memo, obviously an LLM can do a lot for that, and lots of ones in between. And once they had all those scores, allocated them to occupations, and that's basically what we used. So it's something that was pre-existing. And you can debate exactly how you want to define them, but if you look at the charts that Bharat showed earlier, to me it was just remarkable how consistent it was. The more exposed, the more of an effect you saw. It wasn't like noisy. It was quite monotonic.
Yeah, if I could add just one thing to that, if this doesn't necessarily have to be true, but if you thought that these were poor measures of AI exposure, that would actually probably result in not seeing much of an effect. You would actually push the results towards, not seeing very much of an impact by different exposure measures, as opposed to what we see, where we see these pretty striking differences across exposure levels. Now, that doesn't have to be true, but um, as kind of a rule of thumb, that we do think that uh, could be one way of interpreting our results, is that insofar as these measures might not be picking up AI exposure that well, they're still explaining a lot of what's happening in the data.
Yeah, it means if anything, if these are noisy, if these are noisy, then they're underestimating the effect. The effect would be
Yeah.
even bigger if they were less noisy.
Great. Okay, so a question that's near and dear to my heart. You both co-signed a letter with myself and 40 other economists and economic policy experts on the importance of prioritizing good data collection to monitor AI's economic impacts. Can you elaborate to the audience why they should care about this and what data you would like?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because, I mean, one mistaken conclusion to draw from this is that you could just rely on some of the private data and we'd be done. And I've worked with private and public data. They both have great strengths. We're delighted to be able to get such a broad data set so current. At the same time, as we were just discussing, it's not fully representative. And that's something that government data can do is they can make sure that all the different groups answer the questions and we get the broad coverage. And ultimately, government data and private data like this, I see them as complements more than substitutes. We're able to rebalance our sample and be more representative of the US economy because we knew from government data what it was supposed to look like. Now, the government data didn't have all the recency and some of the other variables that we were able to capture here. So the two sets together allow you to answer questions you couldn't have otherwise. Right now, we're in a period, I think, of increasing turbulence in the economy due to AI and other things. We're especially interested in the AI part of it. It could easily become even more chaotic in the coming months and years. So we absolutely need to get better data. We don't want to be flying blind into this. It's one of the most cost-effective investments the government can make. It's a public good that we should absolutely be investing in, and that's why I signed that letter.
And on top of that, not everybody has access to ADP. We're very fortunate that we have access to this data, but it's wonderful when many researchers can study these questions using very high quality data sets. And we want people to do that. We want to get the science right and get the facts right. And the more people are studying this question, the better. And the public government data sources that are out there are invaluable for enabling people to do that.
Great, great. I couldn't have said it better. Okay, let's take another audience question. How would you expect the labor market impacts you find to interact with public sentiment towards AI and in turn the capacity of near and medium term AI progress? So how do you feel this will impact public sentiment? And maybe to add a wrinkle to that, in case you don't want to like gauge public sentiment, have you heard any feedback from people outside of, say, professional economists that like really stood with you, whether it was from the government and policymakers or private sector or labor groups or just people you interact with as part of your day to day?
Well, I feel like often there's too many opinions and not enough facts out there on these topics. So I think it can only help to have more data. And um, the future is not preordained. What we want to do is steer it in directions that are helpful. So when we see that there are some groups that are benefiting, other groups that aren't, that's an opportunity to reskill, retrain, redirect the technology in ways that are more beneficial. And the better data and insight we have, the more we can steer things. There were the overwhelming set of reactions from economists and others was very positive and interested in that. There were, of course, if you go on social media, there are going to be fringes in different directions. I see both the fringes in having kind of a common, I would say, mistake, which is that they treat the world as just like we just have it's just going to happen and there's nothing we can do about it. So the pessimists are like, oh, this is terrible, and the optimists are like, oh no, everything's going to be fine. Both of those, I think, make the mistake that they take away agency from us. And I'm glad that your organization and others are working to try to design policy and others on business decisions in ways that steers towards a better future. But that starts with having the right data. Ultimately, I think we are very much in control of the kind of future we have, and we shouldn't, feel overly optimistic or overly pessimistic that things are just going to play out one way or the other. It's more a matter of the choices we make.
Great. And Brad, if you want to add, feel free. Otherwise, I'll go to the next question.
No, I think Erik covered it great.
Great. Okay, so my next question is for you, Erik. AI's impact on wages and worker productivity is a hot topic, and I know you're a big expert on productivity. About a decade ago, you wrote about the quote unquote great decoupling. Can you explain this concept to our audience and any thoughts you have on this matter today, especially as it pertains to sort of like AI and the work you're doing?
Sure. Um, for a long time, including back a decade ago when Andy and I wrote that piece about the great decoupling, I've been pretty optimistic about the productivity side of things. I do see, eye-popping capabilities, and in our our Stanford AI Index, we describe about 400 pages of lots of charts going up and to the right about the capabilities, and a lot of that does translate sooner or later. Sometimes it takes time into greater output, but at the same time, there's no guarantee that leads to widely shared prosperity. And the great decoupling was describing this pattern that we saw in the data that even as productivity went up, median wages were stagnating. I'm happy to see that since then there's been some improvement, especially recently in median wages. But there's nothing automatic. There's no law in economics or anywhere else that says that when the pie gets bigger, everybody gets a proportional share. It's possible for some people to be left behind, or even worse than that, have negative effects. And we mentioned David Otter earlier. He did some striking work showing that there are many groups that were actually having falling real wages. So that's something we need to work on, is not just make the pie bigger, but also make it something that lots of people benefit from. And I think it's in everyone's interest to do that. Even if you're lucky enough to be on the winning side of the wage equation, it's not great for society when a bunch of people are left behind, and it can lead to dysfunction in our political system. So we all have an interest in creating not just prosperity, but shared prosperity.
Great. And Bharat, feel free to add that if you want, but I can go to the next question. Okay, so someone's asking a question. Are the observed effects specific to the US economy, or are there similar effects in other Western nations? And I'm going to add to that, if your results are specific to the US economy, do you have any plans to look at other nations or know anyone who is doing that?
Right. Our data is from the US. We're using ADP data from the US, and we would absolutely love to study these questions in other countries. A lot of people have been asking us about that, Europe, India, different parts of the world, and I think it's really important to do research on those topics as well. And we're going to try to do that as well, see how far we can take the data. But if people have suggestions on data sources as well that we could use to study these questions in other countries, we would love to see them.
And I am in some conversations, Brad, and I'm sure you're totally up to speed with some folks in other countries that have some data sets. A couple of Scandinavian countries have just absolutely amazing data, and I think we have a chance to look at some of those. We'd love to have, if anyone listening here has other data sets that they can bring us, we'd love to work with them to analyze them. At the same time, a very aggressive agenda we have is to improve our data gathering in the United States. Bharat and the rest of the team at the Digital Economy Lab did a lot of work to create the infrastructure so we could produce this paper. Now that infrastructure has been created, we're in a position to continue to update it. When Bharat gave me the first set of results, it went through May of this year, and as we kind of went back and forth, we did that for a few weeks, and I was like, hey, it's August. Do we have any more recent data? And Ruyu and Bharat dove in, and lo and behold, we could get not just June but also July. So the paper that we have out there right now is like literally like almost up to the month data, and we plan on continuing to do that. Use that infrastructure to basically create an AI economic dashboard that gives us close to real-time evidence about what's happening in the U.S. economy, and hopefully eventually other countries as well.
Great. All right, let's do another audience question. Automation versus augmentation. How different are these effects across age? Are older workers doing better or worse compared to younger workers in occupations that are exposed to augmentation? And just to add to that, in case this specific thing might be a little too granular, are there any other interesting idiosyncrasies you're seeing in the data if you slice and dice it a specific way?
Right. For older workers, we again see these kind of muted effects compared to the impacts are really concentrated on the younger workers. We don't see nearly as much for the older workers, and that's true for both the augmentation measure and the automation measure. If you look at the 26 to 30-year-old group, we see maybe a little bit there as well. That's consistent with the patterns we showed for the youngest group. But for older workers, it's much more muted, these divergences between the groups.
And I'll just underscore that, like, we're able to slice the data fairly finely, but not like infinitely finely.
Yeah.
In the back of the paper, we do the same analysis on the CPS, the current population survey, and there the data is just too coarse. You can't even slice it the way we did. You just get kind of noise. And so one of the advantages of having this bigger data set is we can look at these smaller subgroups, but there are limits at some point.
Okay, so someone asks, how should mid-career professionals upskill to remain competitive as AI development progresses? So I think you did talk about some of the skills that you recommend at least looking into, but I think this question isn't just about mid-career professionals, also maybe linked to a concept of lifelong learning, or at least I'll add that to the question. So any thoughts on how mid-career professionals can upskill to remain competitive as AI development progresses, and any thoughts on lifelong learning more broadly?
Well, let me give kind of a conceptual way that I see a lot of this playing out. A lot of tasks can be broken into three parts. There's conceiving of what you need to do, asking the right questions. There's executing once you have it defined, and then there's verifying and making sure that it got done the way you needed to get it done. Humans are great at all three of those, but machines are getting especially good at the second one. Once it's been well defined what needs to be done, executing that, we see AI agents carrying out more and more of those tasks. And that's putting more and more of a role for people to work on asking the right questions, defining the problem, the upfront part, and also on verifying and seeing if what's done is what you really want to have done. I think those kinds of skills are learnable. They are teachable. Creativity. I think a lot of our education is focused a lot on that middle category, and now we need to think more about the other two categories, whether it's in lifelong learning or in education or on-the-job learning. The other thing I'll mention is that when it comes to policy, I very much believe that I love to have businesses do it, I love to have universities do it, but ultimately this is also a public good, and it's something that if we only rely on the private sector, we're going to have underinvestment. So government needs to either help provide some of that kind of education and training, or subsidize it. So the kind of research that we've been doing here will help provide a little bit of a roadmap of which groups and which kinds of things we're going to need more of and less of. And then that will be an opportunity to reskill the workforce and invest in human capital.
And if I could highlight a few other things that I think would at least be consistent with the results in our paper, I think if we think of the types of tasks that AI might not be as good at, those could include things such as the sort of social skills, the kind of talking to people, getting a sense of people's needs and requirements, and using that to design you know what the strategy of what you want to build, as Erik was saying, and then coming up with a plan for the execution. I think a lot of that could involve a lot of social skills. There's also physical interaction. Those are things that AI is not as capable of doing. And then, as our results suggest, it could be also this aspect of tacit knowledge, things that are not written down, things that you gain with experience. So those are some of the things that we think might be aspects that could be developed as well.
Great. And building on the social skills point, are there any evidence that AI can help people develop their social skills? Like, is there any interactions between the two? I mean, a lot of like HR places are using AI or at least experimenting with it. I'm curious if like teaching empathy or general like social skills is something that AI might maybe not substitute for, but like augment a person or maybe even substitute for. I don't know. I'm asking the question. So curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, this is going a little beyond our paper, but I do see work being done on that. People like Rana Al-Kaloubi have done work on emotional AI systems, and there have been systems that help with autistic kids and therapy that have actually proven to be quite effective. I have a friend who, when he does Zooms like what we're doing here, he has his AI coach afterwards give him feedback about how often he's interrupting people and whether he's being assertive enough and all the other kind of social things in addition to the content. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if that became more widespread. One of the leaders of the AI lab said that he thought that AI may become super persuasive even before it becomes super intelligent, because I do think there are some things that you can do to improve persuasion that go beyond just typical intellectual tasks.
Great. And thanks for your
I think
flexibility on that.
capabilities.
Okay.
The
What's that?
capabilities are changing quickly as well, so
Yeah,
we'll
Yes.
have to see what happens.
Okay, another question from the audience. Do you anticipate that the facts that you identified are going to affect gender balances in sectors? And if you want to talk more broadly, if you've identified any trends based on gender, that would be helpful as well.
Right. We actually do study differences by gender in the paper. We didn't notice any striking differences between men and women. So that's what we know so far, but we're going to continue, like Erik was saying, we're going to continue to track this on an ongoing basis, and we'll see if we notice any notable divergences between men and women.
Great. Okay, another question. If large-scale disruptions occur, what role should social safety nets play in supporting affected workers and communities? Do you have any thoughts on social safety nets broadly? And feel free to pass if you don't want to get too much into policy. And how do you evaluate the possibility of large-scale disruption?
Well, sticking first to the paper, I mean, we do see some changes in occupations becoming, growing in employment and shrinking in employment. If that's due to AI, we don't know for sure, but it's certainly consistent with that story. We may expect that to accelerate over time, and that speaks to retraining. I want to underscore, as I said at the top, while we did have these groups that were falling in employment, we had three other groups that were growing in employment: the more senior people, the less exposed people, and the folks using AI to augment. So, the implication of that is we should be preparing people for those categories that are having growing employment. As Bharat just said, this is a constantly moving target, and so we want to have something close to real-time data where we can understand as the capabilities evolve, whether the employment effects also evolve. You know, as to how disruptive this is going to be, I think it easily could be very disruptive. One of the reasons we want to create this kind of early warning system, this AI economic dashboard, is so we can have something close to real-time information. I can't predict the future, so I don't know for sure what's going to happen. But I think what we can do is, show what's happening in the present. And so much of the data that has been available is with a lag of 2, 3 years, or just not fine-grained enough. So, one of the best things we can do is get something close to really current data, and that's not a perfect substitute for predicting the future, but it's something that will allow us to react a lot faster.
Great. All right, one more question. I don't know if you have enough data for this, but let me know. At a task level, do you see differences in automation versus augmentation trends between the way companies are choosing to deploy AI tools and how individual workers are choosing to use AI tools?
Yeah, I'm not sure we can speak to that in our paper. Now, we are trying to collect some information on company AI adoption, and maybe we'll be able to do more once we have that kind of information. I'm not sure that we can answer that question with the data that we have right now.
Yeah, we're working. We were just talking yesterday to a company, an organization that might be able to provide us with some detailed company data about AI adoption, and so maybe one of our next papers will go into that in more depth. I mean, I have a company called WorkHelix, a startup that does this kind of work, and we are seeing a lot of interest by senior management in using AI for augmentation. I think there's a sense that if you focus too much on just automating or taking costs out, not only is that a lower ceiling, you're not really getting the full benefit of it, but it also leads to kind of a backlash from the workers. And if you want your organization to lean into it, you have to make it more of a win-win. And the augmentative uses of AI are more likely to do that. So there's a lot of interest in trying to achieve that. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that it's often easier to do the cost-cutting ones, that they're just kind of more self-evident. And so there's a little tension there about where the value is versus what's easier to do.
Great. All right, I'm going to close this session with one last question. So, in a minute or two, what is one thing you want the audience to leave with in terms of your research? Whether it's something that you just really want to emphasize or a common misperception people have about your paper or even a policy recommendation. So, what's one thing you want to leave the audience with in a minute or two? And I'll start with you first, Erik.
Well, I think what I'll leave the audience with is this is far from the last word. This is a research agenda, and we're really happy to be able to have these data. And now I feel like we have an infrastructure for building on this and continuing to update. Not only will we be getting new data, but the capabilities are changing. I think more likely than not, this is the early stages of a emerging disruption, and having these tools available so we can track it is something that I think we can contribute at the Digital Economy Lab. Our role is to understand how these remarkable technical capabilities are affecting the economy. I think there's not enough attention on that side of things, and we want to help play that role. So looking forward, you should be expecting more research like this coming out of our lab.
Great. And Bharat, your final thoughts.
Yeah, just one thing I want to add to that, I think, is I think one common misconception about our paper is we don't show that employment is declining. It's not plummeting across the whole economy. We are showing that there are segments of the population where employment growth is still strong, and that includes more experienced workers. It includes these young workers who are in less exposed jobs. And one thing I'll add on top of that is, like Erik was saying before, a lot of these impacts depend on choices we make, how AI is rolled out in a more augmentative versus more automative way. And I think there are a lot of choices that we can make about the direction of AI that could impact some of the employment trends we see.
Great. With that, I want to thank you both, Erik and Bharat, for this fascinating conversation. Before we leave, though, I have a few other people I want to quickly thank, including Chris McKenzie, Justin Bullock, Kirsten D'Souza, and Noah Frank for helping put together this event. These events are not just the people on the screen. There's a lot of people behind the scenes that make these things possible. So thank you, guys. Finally, I want to thank everyone who joined us today, and hopefully we will have you again because we think this is a very important topic. And ARI hopes to do a lot more events on this.
Erik and I would also just like to thank Bryu as well, our collaborator on this project. She did a ton of work on this, and yeah, we want to acknowledge all the work she did to put together this project.
Yeah, Ryushen. Yeah, exactly. So thank you, and thank you, John, and your whole team for inviting us to share some of this work.
Great. Thank you all.